Have you ever watched a man erase a person with nothing louder than the scratch of a pen? Her name was Adeline Merrick, though everyone in the town of Coldwater called her Della when they troubled to call her anything at all. At 11 years old, she was made homeless in a single afternoon because her uncle sold her dead father's land for $4 to settle a bar tab and a grudge. She had one thing left in the world, her father's forge hammer, its handle worn to the shape of his grip. And 10 years later, when a powerful man in a black coat crossed out her name for the second time, he did not know that a secret was already waiting for her, sealed inside a thing so worthless the whole territory laughed at her for buying it. That secret would not only save her, it would unmake him. So, settle in, friend, get comfortable, and before we go on, tell me down in the comments, where in the world are you watching from tonight? The man who signed away her second life was called Josiah Thorne, and he was not a cruel man in the way stories usually mean. He never raised his voice. He never raised his hand. Josiah Thorne did his violence the way a bookkeeper does arithmetic, in a warm office that smelled of beeswax and cold coffee, with the shutters drawn against the summer glare and a ledger open on the desk like a Bible he had written himself. He owned the bank in Coldwater and the freight office. And by way of the freight office, he owned the laundry where Della had scrubbed other people's collars for 6 years, sleeping on a cot in the back and saving her coins in a tobacco tin. She had thought that made her safe. She had thought a ledger could not follow a girl who kept her accounts honest and her debts at zero. She was wrong, because Thorne kept a different set of books than the ones he showed. There is an outstanding balance, Miss Merrick, he said that morning, not unkindly, turning the ledger so she could see the column of figures. Water rights, boiler fuel, depreciation on the premises. Your late employer carried these forward against your wages. It comes to rather more than you have. He tapped a number at the bottom with one clean fingernail. It was a number she had never seen before, a number that had been born somewhere in that office overnight, and it was larger than every coin she had ever touched. She said the account was paid. He said the account was as he showed it. And that was the whole of the trial. Judge and jury and gallows, all of it in a room where the loudest sound was a fly against the window glass. They let her take her clothes and her tin, which held $11 when it was counted. And $11 was the sum of 21 years of living. And they let her take the hammer, because the hammer meant nothing to a man who did his work with ink. It was a smith's crosspeen, heavy as a full heart, the steel head gone soft silver with use, and the hickory shaft darkened, where her father's hand had ridden it 10,000 times. He had made shoes and hinges and plow points with it before the fever took him, and he had told her once, hammering sparks into the dark, that a thing built true will outlive the man who built it. She did not know yet how true that was. She wrapped the hammer in a flour sack, put the tin in her skirt, and walked out of Coldwater into the last of the green. She walked west because west was downhill, and downhill was easier, and because there was nothing behind her but a name crossed out twice. For 2 days, the country was the country she knew. Low rolling fields, fat with June, cottonwoods leaning silver over creeks, the smell of cut hay and manure and wet clay, the managed and fenced and watered world where every acre belonged to someone with a paper to prove it. Then the fences thinned. Then the fences stopped. And on the third day, the land changed under her feet the way a voice changes when it stops lying to you. The green burned off into a pale, immense country that did not care whether she lived. The grass went from knee-high to ankle-high to a thin gray stubble, and then to nothing at all but sage and rabbit brush, and the low silver haze of them stretching flat to a horizon so far it seemed to bend. The air went dry and enormous. Sound simply left, the way water leaves a cracked jar, until she could hear her own blood in the small grit of her shoes, and once a hawk crying so far up it was only a speck turning against a sky the color of scalded milk. At night the cold came down out of that sky like a lid, and the stars were so thick and near she felt she could cut her hand on them. She had never in her life been so alone, and she found, to her own surprise, that she was not entirely afraid of it. Solitude had at least never sent her a bill. She came on the 9th day, footsore and burned brown, to a rail and mining town called Quartz Hollow, which had been born rich and was dying poor. It sat in the mouth of a canyon where the mountains broke down into red rock and scree, a single crooked street of false front stores, a stamp mill gone silent up the slope, a saloon, an assay office, a church with no paint. The silver had thinned out years back, the mine had closed its best levels, and the town was the kind of place that survives on the memory of money. She rented a corner of a widow's porch for a nickel a night and looked for work, and while she looked, she listened, because a person with no place learns fast that listening is the cheapest coat there is. That was how she heard about the claim. Men said it in the saloon and outside the assay office. Said it the way you say a thing that has become a joke so old it has stopped being funny. The Dutchman's claim, up Dead Mule Canyon, the deadest hole in the district, a played-out patch of rock with a fallen adit and a wrecked ore car and a stone shack the roof had quit. A German prospector named Kraus had worked it 30 years back, got nothing, and died of nothing in particular, and the claim had passed from fool to fool ever since, each one hoping the last had missed something, each one finding out different. The territory held it now for back taxes. $4 would buy the paper on it, and any man in the hollow would tell you, laughing, that $4 was $3.50 too much. Della walked out to see it on a Sunday when the walking was free. Dead Mule Canyon was a slot in the red rock a mile above town, choked with juniper and shattered stone, and the claim sat at the head of it where a seep of alkali water made a green stain and a stand of stunted cottonwood. There was the ore car, off its rails, and rusted the deep bloody orange of old iron, half full of waste rock and pack rat leavings. There was the adit, its timbers caved, breathing out the cool grave smell of the deep earth. And there was the shack, 4 walls of dry-laid stone standing patient under a sky that had taken its roof for a keepsake. She stood in the ruin of it and felt something she had no word for, something that was not hope, because she had quit hope in a warm office in Coldwater. It was recognition. The place had been thrown away, and so had she, and thrown away things know each other. She paid the $4. She counted the coins onto the assay clerk's desk while he tried not to grin, 4 silver dollars ringing down one after another, and he stamped the paper and handed it across and said, "Miss, you have just bought yourself the finest view of nothing in the territory." Word went around the hollow by supper. The laundry girl from nowhere had bought the Dutchman's grave. Men lifted their glasses to her health and her wisdom. A boy threw a clod at her as she walked back up the canyon with her hammer and a borrowed shovel and a sack of cornmeal, and she did not turn around because she had learned in Coldwater that turning around is how they know they've hit you. She made the shack livable first, because a body must sleep. She cleared the rat nests and the fallen stone, and she found in the rubble the small honest gifts of a dead man's house, a cracked crock, a rusted skillet, the bowl of a clay pipe, 3 square-cut nails she straightened on a flat rock with her father's hammer and saved, because a nail is a nail. She stretched her blanket and a piece of canvas over the fallen roof beams and made a lean-to corner that kept the dew off. She dug a fire pit and hauled water from the alkali seep and let it settle till the top ran almost clean. And every evening, when the light went long and red down the canyon, she took the hammer out of the flour sack and held it a while, not for any reason, just to feel the shape of her father's hand still worn into the wood, and then she wrapped it up again and slept. She worked the claim the way he had taught her to work steel, slow, attentive, listening to the material. She had no illusion of striking silver where 30 years of fools had struck none. What she had was a laundress's patience and a smith's eye and nothing else in the world to do. She cleared the fallen adit timber by timber, propping as she went with juniper poles, and found the old level pinched down to a dead face of barren quartz, exactly as advertised. And she did not weep because she had half expected it, and because weeping wastes water. Then she turned to the ore car, that great rusted coffin of waste rock, because it was the one thing left she had not touched, and because a car with waste still in it was a question nobody had bothered to finish asking. It took her 3 days to empty it, 3 days of shovel and bar and blistered hands wrapped in strips of her spare petticoat, 3 days of lifting rock the color of dried blood and pitching it down the dump, while the sun came over the east rim at 10 and left the west rim at 4, and the silence pressed in on her like a hand. On the 3rd afternoon, near the bottom, her shovel struck something that did not ring like stone. It gave, and it thudded, a low wooden note, and she went down on her knees in the iron dust and dug with her fingers, and there, wedged and packed under 60 years of ore, was the corner of a box, not a miner's box. A strong box, oak bound in iron straps, the wood gone black and the iron gone orange, the whole of it seized and married into one dead weight. Someone had put it in the bottom of that car and buried it under waste and rolled the waste on top and let the world forget the whole thing. Then, silence. She sat back on her heels in the ruin of the light and understood that she had bought more than a view. Now, before I tell you what was in that box, let me stop and ask you something because I've been turning it over myself. Picture it. You've been erased, robbed, laughed out of one town, and half starved into the next. You've spent nearly your last coin on a joke, and now your fingers are on the corner of a locked strongbox in the belly of a rusted ore car, and you are entirely alone in a canyon where no one would come if you screamed. Do you break it open right there, hands shaking, and find out what your whole ruined life has been walking toward? Or do you cover it back up, sleep on it, and decide in daylight what kind of person you're about to become? Tell me what you do down in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if this story's got its hook in you, do me a small kindness and subscribe, because the next part is where it turns, and I'd hate for you to miss the turning. She did not open it in the car. She could not. The lid was rusted shut, and the box was fast in the waste rock. She freed it over 2 more days, chipping the ore away with a cold chisel and her father's hammer, wringing the steel down soft and even the way he'd shown her so the chisel bit and did not skate. And when it came loose, at last she could not lift it, so she knew before she opened it that it was heavy, with something better than rock. She broke the hasp with the peen. The lid came up with a shriek of rust that ran up the canyon and back. And inside, wrapped in oilcloth, gone stiff as bark, were 2 things that would remake the world. The first was gold. Coins, double eagles, $20 pieces stamped with the year 1861 and the years around it, stacked in canvas rolls that had rotted so the coins spilled loose and heavy and cold into her hands. More money than she had ever imagined, touching more than the laundry earned in 10 years, more than the bank in Coldwater kept in its little back safe. She let them run through her fingers in the red light, and they were beautiful. And they meant, in that first hour, exactly nothing to her, because gold was the thing they had used to erase her, and she trusted it about as far as she trusted Josiah Thorne. The second thing in the box was worth more than the gold, though it would take her a long night of reading to understand it. It was a leather-bound ledger, and beneath the ledger, a packet of letters tied in faded ribbon, and beneath the letters, folded small and stained dark at one corner with something that was not ink, a bundle of papers with an official seal. And on the inside of the box lid, scratched deep into the oak with a nail by a hand that knew it was running out of time, were 4 words, "They mean to kill us." She read all that night by a fire of juniper that spat and perfumed the dark, and the story came up out of those pages the way a body comes up out of a river, slow, and then all at once, and terrible. The ledger belonged to the mining and freight company that had built this whole district 30 years gone, and it had been kept by the German Kraus, who was not a lone fool prospector at all, but the company's bookkeeper and one of its 4 founding partners. 4 men had built Quartz Hollow. Kraus, who kept the books, a Cornish miner named Trevanion, who knew the rock, a teamster named Hollis, who ran the freight, and a young financier from back east who put up the capital and kept the deeds and drew the maps. The mine had come in rich in 1861, richer than any of them let the world know, and they had done the sensible, frightened thing that rich men in a lawless country do. They had converted the first great cleanup into gold coin, and they had made a plan to move it quietly east to a real bank in a single strongbox on a single wagon, guarded by all 4 partners so that no one man could betray the rest. But one man did. The letters told it, and the ledger proved it, and the 4 scratched words under the lid confirmed it in the dark. The young financier had arranged for the wagon to be robbed on the trail, a staged robbery, hired men and dusters coming out of the rocks in a narrow place, and the plan was never robbery at all, but murder. All 3 partners shot dead and left for the buzzards, and the crime laid on road agents who would never be found because they had been paid and sent to Mexico. He would grieve in public, inherit the whole enterprise by the partnership articles he himself had drawn, and walk east, a rich and blameless man on the bones of the men who had built it with him. And it had very nearly gone exactly so. Trevanion, the Cornishman, died in the rocks. Hollis, the teamster, died at the rains. But Kraus, shot through and left for dead, had crawled. He had crawled with the strong box, lashed to a mule, up the one canyon. Nobody would look in. The dead one the Dutchman's, and he had hidden the gold and the proof in his own played-out ore car under a roll of waste rock, and he had scratched his last testimony into the oak, and then he had died of his wounds in the stone shack she now called home, alone, believing the truth would die with him. It had, for 30 years, it had waited in the dark for someone the world had thrown away to come dig it out. The letters were signed, the deeds were signed, the partnership articles were signed, and the name on them, the young financier who had murdered 3 men and stolen a district and walked east clean, the name written in a younger, hungrier version of a hand she knew because she had watched it cross her own name out of a ledger not 2 weeks past, was Josiah Thorne. He had not gone east and stayed. He had gone east, laundered the fortune through a bank, come back under the respectability money buys, and settled 200 miles away in the green country in a town called Coldwater, where he grew slowly and quietly into the most powerful man in the county, buying land, buying paper, buying a girl's family farm out from under her drunkard uncle for $4 when she was 11, because it lay across a right-of-way he wanted, and casting the same girl out a second time 10 years later over a debt he invented in a warm office. He was tied to her by more than cruelty. He had made her poor twice, once as a child and once as a woman, and both times to feed the same hunger that had, before she was ever born, made him a murderer. She sat with that until the fire burned to coals and the east rim went gray, and she did not feel triumph. She felt cold and clear and very old. She told no one. A secret is only a weapon while it's a secret, her father used to say, of the way a smith hides the temper of a blade until it's tested, and she meant to test this one. But she could not do it alone, and a woman alone in that country who suddenly had gold could not stay alone and alive for long. So she did the slow human work, the work you cannot rush, of finding people. There was an old man named Absalom Pike who kept the assay office, 70 if he was a day, hand-spotted and sure, who had been a boy in Quartz Hollow the year the founders died and who had never once believed the road agent story. She brought him her ore samples first, honest business, and let him teach her to pan and blow pipe and read a streak. And over the weeks of small transactions, a trust grew between them that neither named. There was the widow whose porch she'd rented, Marta Vane, a big raw-boned Swede who had buried 2 husbands in a mine's worth of illusions and who took to Della the way weather takes to a mountain without ceremony. Because Della split her wood without being asked and never once lied to her. And there was a tradesman, a smith named Ortega, whose forge stood at the low end of the street, who watched Della walk past with her father's hammer wrapped in a flour sack, and one day, without a word, set a stool by his fire for her. That was how they came together, not with speeches, but with small, practical acts of mutual aid, the currency of people the world has forgotten to rob. Della fixed the widow's stove and reset her door. Pike saved her the good coffee and taught her the assay. Ortega let her use his forge in the evenings when the coals were dying anyway, and the first time she took up his hammer and drew a length of iron down to a true taper without a wasted blow, he stood back with his arms folded and said, "Who taught you that?" "My father," she said. He nodded once, the way one craftsman acknowledges another across a fire, and after that the forge was half hers. She still told none of them what she'd found. But she began, carefully, to change a few of the double eagles into ordinary coin at scattered places on her trips down valley, and to lay in tools and timber and a milk goat and window glass, and Quartz Hollow began to notice that the Dutchman's grave had smoke coming off it, and that the laundry girl who'd bought a joke was somehow eating. It was Pike who gave her the line she carried the rest of her life, though she didn't understand it when he said it. She had asked him, over the essay fire one cold evening, whether he thought a man like the one who'd killed the founders, whoever he was, could ever really be brought to book after 30 years, or whether time just swallowed a thing like that whole. The old man tapped his pipe out against his boot and looked into the coals a long while. "Girl," he said, "gold sinks and truth floats. You just got to be patient enough to be standing there when it comes up." Then he changed the subject to the weather, the way old men do when they've said the one true thing they mean to say all week. She thought it was just talk. Months later, she'd understand he told her exactly how the whole thing would end. Months passed, and they were good months, the best she had known, and that is precisely when the country turns on you. She had brought Pike into the secret by then, because she needed a man who could read old assay records and swear to the gold's origin, and Pike had gone gray reading Krause's ledger and had whispered, "I knew those men. I knew Trevanion," in a voice that shook Together, they had begun quietly to prepare the evidence, to make fair copies, to write to the territorial marshal's office 200 miles distant, a letter that would take weeks to arrive and weeks to answer. But 200 miles is far, and secrets have a way of leaking through the cracks in a small town, and somewhere in the changing of a double eagle or the ordering of window glass or a word said too loud in a saloon, the wrong ear caught the shape of it. Because a rich man 200 miles away had spent 30 years paying certain men to bring him a certain kind of rumor, the way a spider pays out silk, and one of those rumors reached Coldwater on the autumn stage, that the played-out Dutchman claim in Quartz Hollow had a girl on it, a laundry girl he had cast out, and that she had lately come into gold. Josiah Thorne did not come himself. Men like Thorne never come themselves. That was the whole architecture of his life. He sent a man the way he sent everything through paper and proxy. The man's name was said to be Creel, and he came into Quartz Hollow on a rented horse with a rifle and a saddle scabbard and a way of looking at a street that took its measure the way a butcher takes a hog's. He asked no questions in the saloon. He watched. He was a tracker and an enforcer, and Pike said low, having seen his, like before, a man who had done the sort of trail work in his youth that the Founder's killers had done, and Della understood that Thorne had reached back 30 years into his own worst self and sent the present a piece of the past. Creel watched the claim for 2 days from the east rim, a patient dark shape against the rock. And on the third night, when the moon was down and the canyon was black as the inside of the box, he came up Dead Mule Canyon on foot to end the leak before it could reach the marshal. She was not asleep. She had not slept easy since she'd seen him on the rim. Some animal part of her had counted the days along with him. She heard the scree turn under a boot at the canyon mouth. One small wrong sound in a silence. She now knew the way she knew her own breath. And she was up and out of the lean-to with the fire banked to nothing and her back to the cold stone of the shack wall before he reached the seep. She had the strongbox papers already sewn into her coat lining, that day's fear having taught her that much. What she had in her hands was her father's hammer. Creel came into the ruin low and fast, and sure, a knife, not a gun, because a shot would carry down to town. And he was very good, and for a moment in the dark it was very close and very bad. He caught her by the coat, and the knife came up. But he did not know the ground, and she did. She knew every fallen stone of that shack in the dark, because she had cleared each one with her own hands, and she took him back over the low broken wall where Kraus had died. And as he went down off balance into the rubble, she brought the hammer around in a short flat arc, all her father's teaching in it, no wasted motion, the peen where the temper lived. And the sound it made was the sound of a claim being settled. Then silence. Real silence, the enormous canyon kind, with her own blood loud in her ears, and the man not moving in the starlight, and her father's hammer hanging from her hand as heavy as it had ever been. It was nothing. It was everything. She did not weep. She sat down against the wall and waited for the gray. And when it came, she walked down to town and told the truth, all of it, to Pike and the widow and Ortega and anyone who would come, because a secret had done its work, and now she needed witnesses more than she needed shadows. Creel lived. That mattered. Later. The hammer had put him down but not out, and Ortega and 2 other men brought him down the canyon trust like a hog, and he woke in the widow's shed with a headache and a lawyer's problem because the marshal was already coming. The letter Della and Pike had sent weeks before had found the right desk. And the man who rode into Quartz Hollow 11 days later was not the shootist of the storybooks, but something rarer, and to a man like Thorne, far more dangerous. A United States Marshal named Ezra Boone, gray-mustached and unhurried, who wore his authority like an old coat and carried a satchel of documents the way another man carries a gun. He did not raise his voice. He did the one thing Thorne had built his whole life on the assumption that no one would ever do. He read Krause's ledger and the partnership articles and the letters, and he laid the founder's original deeds beside the papers Thorne had filed 30 years gone to inherit the district, and he compared the signatures with Pike swearing to the assay history and the widow swearing to the coin and the whole town of Quartz Hollow, which had lived under a lie for a generation, crowding the assay office to swear to whatever a man could swear to. Boone took depositions for 4 days in Pike's slow, careful hand. He examined the strong box and the 4 scratched words under the lid. He sent writers. He was patient, exactly as patient as Pike had said truth was, and Della understood at last what the old man had meant. Gold sinks and truth floats. She had only had to be patient enough to be standing there when it came up, and now here it was, come up into the daylight in the hands of a man the law could not buy, because Boone had already been rich in the only coin he cared about, which was the plain, unbending fact of a thing. There was no shootout. That is not how these things truly end, whatever the dime novels say. Marshal Boone rode the 200 miles to Coldwater with a wagon of certified documents and 2 deputies and a warrant, and he walked into the warm, beeswax-smelling office where Josiah Thorne kept his ledgers, and he laid the founder's deeds on the desk beside Thorne's own younger signature, and he said quietly what the paper said. And the powerful man who had erased 100 people with a pen, who had murdered 3 partners and stolen a district and cast out the same girl twice, who had never in his life been made to look at the thing he was looked at it. Witnesses said he did not shout or run or reach for anything. He simply sat down, though he was already sitting, some inward part of him sitting down, and the color went out of him. And by the time they had him in the wagon, he was an old man and no longer anyone to be afraid of. He collapsed in the end, not from a bullet, but from the simple, unbearable weight of being seen. The truth did not shoot him. It rendered him irrelevant, which is the only death a man like that ever truly fears. He was tried where the crime was done, and the district he had stolen was returned to the founder's heirs, and there being none but the town itself. To the town, and Josiah Thorne went into a territorial cell, and out of the story, and the last anyone in Coldwater heard of him, he had gone quiet and small, a man of paper, with the papers finally read. Della did not go to the trial. She had said her piece to Marshal Boone in Pike's slow hand, and that was enough. She had no wish to stand in a room and watch the man be small. She had a home to build, and building it was the work that earned her the thing the gold never could. For here is the turn under the turn, the thing she came to understand over the seasons that followed. The reward money and the founder's unclaimed shares came to her by law, a sum that made her, on paper, one of the richest young women in the territory, and it changed almost nothing about how she lived, because she had learned in the belly of that ore car that money is only the tool the world uses to decide who counts, and she had quit letting the world decide that about her. The next spring, she did not leave Coors Hollow for the green country and an easy life. She stayed. She put a real roof on Krause's stone shack, timber and shingle she raised with Ortega and 2 other men, over 3 days of laughter and skinned knuckles, and she planted the alkali seep ground with the cottonwood's children and made the green stain into a true small green place. She used the gold the way her father would have wanted it used, not to buy power, but to build things that would outlive her. She reopened the stamp mill so the men of the dying town had work. She staked Ortega to a proper forge and took her turn at its fire. She paid for the church to be painted and for a school to be raised and for the widow Vane to stop renting her porch to strangers and live out her years easy. She learned the district's rock from Pike until the old man passed one winter in his sleep. Having lived, he told her at the end long enough to see the truth float, which was as much as any man could ask. She became, over years, not the laundry girl from nowhere and not the rich woman from the strongbox, but simply Della Merrick of Quartz Hollow, who kept her accounts honest and her word better, whose forge you could bring a broken thing to and get it back whole, whose name the town said, now, with the particular weight a town gives a name it has decided to trust. She had been erased twice with a pen. She wrote herself back in with a hammer, one true stroke at a time, and no one could cross it out again, because she had earned it in the one currency that cannot be forged, which is work witnessed by people who love you. She kept the double eagles she had spent so carefully, but she kept one thing more carefully than any coin. On the mantle of the stone house, above the fire, she hung her father's hammer, the cross-peen worn silver, the hickory dark with 2 men's worth of gripping now, and beside it, framed, the 4 words scratched into a scrap of oak she had pried from the strongbox lid, "They mean to kill us." Children who came to the school she'd built would ask her sometimes whether it was true that she'd once bought the deadest hole in the district for $4 and pulled a fortune out of it, and she would tell them yes, and they would ask if it wasn't the luckiest $4 anyone ever spent, and she would look at the hammer on the mantle and the green place out the window and the town whose smoke she could see from her door, and she would tell them the truth. The gold was never the treasure. The gold was just the thing that bought her time to find the treasure. And the treasure was this: the roof, and the fire, and the school, and the friends who'd carried a trust killer down a canyon for her and sworn the truth for her in an old man's careful hand. It was the best $4 she ever spent, and not 1 cent of what made it worth spending had anything to do with the gold. So that's her story, friend. And if you've stayed with me all the way to the end of it, truly thank you. I know your time is worth more than gold, and you spent some of it here with Della and me, and I don't take that lightly. Here's what I keep coming back to, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. The world is very quick to write things off. It writes off a played out claim, a rusted ore car, a stone shack with no roof. It writes off a laundry girl with no name and no money and nothing but her dead father's hammer. And every single time, the thing or the person the world called worthless turned out to be holding the truth that set everyone free. The value was there the whole time. It just needed somebody patient enough to dig. So tell me down in the comments, what have you found real value in something or some person the world had already given up on? I read every one of these, truly. I do. If this story moved you, do me the kindness of a like and subscribe so you're here for the next one, and share it with someone who needs to hear that they were never as worthless as they were told. We read everyone. Until next time, stay close.